So we're talking about international political economy, or how the global economy works, or how we think the global economy works. And so I want to introduce a couple different theories about how we think the global economy works and the policy recommendations that follow from those theories and those assumptions we make about the global economy. And before I jump into talking about the two competing theories, we'll talk about economic liberalism and economic nationalism. I want to just kind of rehash a common talking point of mine, which is that theories are just sets of ideas about how the world works. They take a very complex system, a complex world, and distill it down to a handful of ideas, of causal relationships, of assumptions. They focus our attention on certain things and really push aside other things. And so all theories are, I oftentimes say, all theories are lies, but really what they are is they're simplifications. They're taking all that complexity and saying, don't worry about that complexity, make a couple key assumptions, focus on a few things, and that will help you to navigate the international system. And indeed, that's the measure of what makes a theory good. Not that it's true, not that it's describing the international system correctly or perfectly or completely, but that it focuses us on the things that help us to navigate the world effectively. And so one of the things that I also want to draw attention to is that theories are normative, oftentimes. They make assumptions about how we should act to get the kind of things that we want to do. So if I want a certain set of outcomes, the theory should guide me in getting those outcomes. And if it guides me correctly and successfully, that suggests that the theory is useful, that it's helpful, that it's helping me to navigate the international system. And so when I say that the theories are normative, what I'm saying is that there are different things that we might want to achieve that oftentimes are emphasized by those theories or assumed by those theories. And so one thing that we oftentimes want to see out of economic policy is prosperity. We want to see rising standards of living. We want to see unemployment being low. We want to see maybe inflation being controlled. We want people's economic well-being to be rising. Prosperity is something that we might emphasize. And in fact, economic liberalism emphasizes that as sort of the primary thing that we're targeting with economic policy. But that's not the only thing that we might be interested in. We might also be interested in ensuring that our state has a strong base for military power. Right, that your industrial sector, your tech sector is supporting your ability to conduct war. And certainly that's something that states pay attention to. And mercantilism or economic nationalism would actually say that that's really the whole point of economic policy, is to ensure that your state has the kind of economy that allows for the state to maintain its power base in the international system. And so that means not just prosperity, it means you need a large economy, right? So I guess prosperity goes along with that. But it's not because you want your population necessarily to be better off, just that there's a larger economy being out there. And you want your manufacturing base, your technology base, maybe even your agricultural base to be able to support you in the conduct of modern warfare. And there's a famous debate in 1992 between Bill Clinton, George Bush Sr., and Ross Perot about NAFTA and trade. And George Bush makes an observation that it doesn't matter what you make in a global economy, whether it's computer chips or potato chips, as long as you're making something, as long as you're contributing to a global economy. And Bill Clinton punches back and says, no, it absolutely makes a difference what you're making in a global economy. And the United States needs to be the country that's making computer chips, not potato chips. And that's highlighting this sort of idea of economic nationalism, that we care about what we're producing with that economy. And we want to make sure that it's the things that will support national power. A final goal that some states might pursue in terms of international political economy is autarky, right? Economic self-sufficiency, that you don't rely upon anybody else for your economic well-being. And certainly economic nationalism or mercantilism will emphasize this. Different strains of Marxism will emphasize this as an important economic goal. And we oftentimes see policymakers and politicians arguing for this, right? In the United States, there's been a 2-decade discussion about achieving North American energy independence, that between the United States and Canada, being able to supply all the energy needs and not being reliant upon oil supplies coming from the Middle East or from Russia is an important national economic goal. People oftentimes talk about agricultural production, being able to feed yourself as an important goal. Again, they're referencing back to this idea of autarky. In practice, no country has been able to achieve total autarky, to be able to completely cut themselves off, but limited autarky is something that states will oftentimes talk about as a goal. Okay, so I want to pivot now to talking about the assumptions of these two different theories, economic liberalism and economic nationalism. And I'll talk through economic liberalism first, along with some of the policy recommendations that come from this. And so economic liberalism tends to follow a lot of the assumptions of Wilsonian liberalism that we've talked about earlier when talking about international politics more generally. It sees the international system as teeming with lots of different actors, right? There's states that are out there, but there's also firms, right? Businesses, sometimes multinational corporations. There's individuals who are playing a role. They're making decisions about investing. They're making decisions about what to buy, right? Economic life is teeming with all of these different actors. And one of the important roles of states is to provide regulation and rules that allow for markets to function efficiently. And beyond that, there's not really a strong role laid out for the state under economic liberalism. And part of that is because economic liberalism emphasizes the idea that competition in the international system through trade, through investment, through markets is going to lead to greater efficiency. It's sort of at a foundational level, there's this belief that competition is positive sum, and that states should actually seek to encourage that and not interfere with that process of competition driving prosperity. And so in a sense, states become minimally important in economic relations. They're there to enforce contract law, they're there to enforce property rights, they're there to negotiate trade agreements, but they shouldn't be playing a heavy-handed role in trying to control the nature of that global competition and trade. And this perspective really came to prominence in the 20th century. The United States laid some of the foundation for this at the end of World War II, and we'll talk about the global economic infrastructure behind that. But really from 1972 on through, I would say, the last up until the last 10 years, the international system was really drifting in this direction of economic liberalism and embracing this idea that the state should minimize its role in controlling economic outcomes and rather should embrace competition. And we saw this in the Western world with deregulation in the 1970s, and an embrace of international finance, an embrace of expanded trade. We saw this in the communist world, where the collapse of the Soviet Union and the opening of China really meant an abandoning of total economic control by the state and various different degrees of opening up to competition and trade and to international engagement. And then in the developing world, or what we sometimes call the third world, we saw an opening to trade and investment, a move away from Marxist ideas about autarky and trying to cut yourself off from global trade, and really an embrace of global trade and an emphasis on deregulation of markets. So we really saw this drift in terms of the international system toward a more market-driven and integrated economic system. And there came to be a set of ideas about how you facilitate this or make this work, and states were encouraged to follow a series of policies that came to be called the Washington Consensus, not because it was being pushed by Washington, by the United States, but it was also being pushed by the International Monetary Fund, by the World Bank, by wealthy donor states beyond the United States and the European Union and others, and also by economists and oftentimes by pundits and I guess social scientists. And so the Washington Consensus involves a range of different policies. I'll talk about a few of these now, and I'll sort of flag that some of these we're going to talk about in much greater detail later, right? So one of those is fiscal discipline. So fiscal discipline referring to your budgets, fiscal for your state, and the idea that you should be maintaining balanced budgets. You shouldn't be running large deficits, that accumulating large amounts of debt is bad for your long-term economic well-being. So balance your budgets. Public spending of states, if you're thinking about how to balance your budgets, the public spending that states do engage in should be focused on things that will give you an economic return. So education, great. Build up your population's skill sets, great. Healthcare, great. Keep your population alive. Infrastructure, building bridges and roads and ports and airports and all that good stuff, great. That will give you an economic return. Defense spending is thought to be less important for an economic return, and so states were encouraged to abandon defense spending or to reduce defense spending. And likewise, subsidies. Subsidies were oftentimes a common feature in developing countries to make fuel or food or water cheaper for people. Those subsidies distort markets and or alter competition, and economists tell us are inefficient. And so the Washington consensus would say stop doing those kinds of things because they're distorting markets and costing you money, and that money be better spent in balancing your budget. Low tax rates were encouraged, particularly lowering tariff barriers, particularly taxes on foreign investment, lowering taxes on industry to sort of encourage economic activity. The money supply should be controlled by professionals, not by politicians. Essentially, who has the right to flip on the printing press? And the idea is that if politicians have that right and are able to flip on the printing press when they choose, they're going to use that for their economic well-being, and that may distort inflation or increase inflation. That may distort your economy, and it's better to leave those decisions about when to run the printing press in the hands of economists who, I guess, make those decisions for the good of the economy rather than the good of politicians. So economists tell us about how that works. We'll talk about the money supply and that idea of control by professionals in quite a bit more detail. Likewise, we're going to talk about exchange rates being driven by markets. This is also one of these things that the Washington Consensus encourages. It encourages us to move to a global financial system in which markets drive currency values rather than state dictates. Markets should be open to trade and investment. Again, we'll talk more about why trade is thought to be efficient and why this is encouraged. States are encouraged to deregulate their economy and to privatize national industries. So in many countries and many places, there are businesses that are run by the state and are owned by the state and are insulated from competition because the state is able to subsidize them, support them, or block competition, right? So in my home state of North Dakota, we have a state flour mill. That would be an example of a state-run industry, and the Washington Consensus would encourage the state of North Dakota to sell that off, to get that in private hands where it's going to be run more efficiently and respond to market forces rather than to be a state industry. And then finally, the Washington Consensus would say protect property rights, make sure that when foreign firms purchase a chunk of land, that chunk of land is respected under law, and if you do all of these things collectively, you should be maximizing your level of competition within the global system, and that will result in economic prosperity, a positive sum outcome. So the idea goes. And again, this set of ideas has really come to dominate the international system for much of the second half of the 20th century, the first part of the 21st century. It may be losing some of its dominance, but we'll talk about that and what might be replacing it when we pivot now to economic nationalism, which is a different perspective on how the global economy works. It's much more closely aligned with realism, that it places states central to the story and says that states are the central economic actors in the entire international system. And if you want to understand how the global economy functions, you need to pay attention to states and what states are doing, how they're structuring the rules around that global system. And the competition that occurs globally in economics shouldn't be understood from the perspective of overall efficiency and prosperity and thinking about it in terms of a positive sum. It should be understood as how states view it. All right, competition between states where some are gaining and some are losing. It should be understood as zero-sum competition, in which states are seeking to win, to gain advantage, rather than simply to achieve a net prosperity for everybody. And states prefer, when they're thinking about about the international system, they prefer military power, but see economic power oftentimes as a means to achieve that, right? That economic power, your steel production, your microchip production, your innovation, all of that is going to be foundational to military power, and states are going to foster economic prosperity because it helps them to achieve what they want, which is military power. But there's also a sort of a reverse relationship, which is that if you have military power or power of any kind within the international system, you can potentially use that to gain economic advantage. And so, economic liberalism sort of sees states as really secondary and detached actors in terms of the global economy. economic nationalism sees states as front and center in that story, and as active participants and even active combatants in that process of setting global economic policy and rules. And so thinking about how this has played out over the years, one framework in which economic nationalism has kind of played out as policy is mercantilism. Mercantilism is a variant of economic nationalism that was widespread from 1500 to about the publishing of Adam Smith's The Wealth of Nations, and it begins with the assumption that markets are fixed, right? So it really gets to that idea of zero-sum competition, right? That if you are a cobbler and you're thinking about, the market for shoes, you're assuming that there's, however many people in the world, they each have 2 feet. That's your market for shoes. Markets are fixed, and the only way to be able to sell more shoes is to crowd out your competition. And modern economists, and I think modern economic theory would reject this and say, no, that's actually not the case, that markets are not fixed, that markets can grow, that consumption, people don't just own one pair of shoes, they can, have dress shoes and athletic shoes and, dancing shoes. Like, there's lots of ways, cobblers can sell more than one pair of shoe to people, and the number of shoes that people will consume is a function of their own prosperity, and so markets can expand. But if you're thinking about the world from 1500 from the perspective of European colonial power, you're thinking about expanding your markets. You're thinking about the coastline of the world and the number of potential port cities that you can reach to. And if you get there first and you set up a trade relationship with that city, suddenly you are the point of contact. And there really are only so many cities on the coast. And so this idea that maybe we should think about export markets as fixed, even if consumption isn't technically fixed, maybe still makes a little bit of sense. If you're, 1600s and you're thinking about, the global economy from the perspective of a state, you're thinking about your own economic well-being in terms of capital, which is essentially how much cash or gold do you have in your vault. And you get capital by exporting things, right? You sell stuff out and gold comes in, and you take a cut and you put it in your vault, and that's amazing because if you have more gold in your vault, you're going to be able to hire mercenaries. You're going to be able to fund your military. You're going to be able to go out and fund a navy that's going to be able to go out and take more cities and export markets and colonize more territories that allow for you to export more stuff and get more gold and put that gold in your vault, and it becomes this sort of virtuous, well, I don't want to describe the process of colonialism as virtuous, but from the perspective of a state, right, it's a reinforcing positive cycle that leads to you getting more of what you want. And that involves using the military to win this zero-sum economic competition. Typically today, we don't rely upon the military to advance economic interests. 200 years ago, it was very commonplace for states to send their militaries out to march on capitals and seize treasuries to pay debts, or to use warships to open up markets, whether that's the U.S. showing up in Japan with a gunship and forcing Japan to sign a trade treaty that it wasn't interested in, or whether it's European colonial powers, essentially opening up China's markets by force. Right? That pattern doesn't exist in quite the same way, or doesn't make quite the same amount of financial sense, given how expensive military power is today. But it doesn't mean that states are any less involved in trying to win a zero-sum struggle for within international economics. And one of the places that we can maybe see this playing out is this idea of export-led development, which is another sort of policy application of economic nationalism. That if you believe that global competition is zero sum and you're trying to seize the biggest share of export markets that you can, then maybe you want to do this. Maybe you want to use government power to protect domestic industries, throwing up tariff barriers to block foreign goods from coming in, taking government resources and funneling them to specific industries. So you're picking winners and you are helping them to achieve globally competitive presences, right? So maybe you're funneling technology to them, or innovation. Maybe you're funneling land or water or other things that they need for inputs to them, at a reduced price. Maybe you're offering zero interest or no interest loans. And the thinking is that if you can build up these robust export industries that are able to seize a good chunk of the global export market, that's going to provide cash coming into the rest of your economy. That's going to be the engine that drives your entire economy. And so governments can work in all sorts of ways, not just in terms of providing domestic support, low interest loans, no interest loans, subsidies, all sorts of goodies to help businesses become successful, but they can also work the international system as well to try to create a favorable market, right? They can try to negotiate trade treaties where those industries that they're trying to support have access to other countries and have access to those markets. Maybe they negotiate treaties or purchase agreements to get access to raw materials at a favorable price. Right? There are things that states can do to really benefit those export sectors. And some countries have used this very successfully. Japan, South Korea, Taiwan all used this very successfully in the 20th century. The United States used something very similar to this in the 19th century. And China has used a variant of this with its industrialization process since the 1970s. And I'll just flag with the Chinese model of economic development that the state plays a very heavy role. Oftentimes those industries aren't just picked by the government and the private sector industries that are being supported, they're actually state-owned industries that are being supported by the government and pushed by the government to be successful and be the anchor of the Chinese economy. This is similar to the economic model that Lenin used shortly after the revolution in the Soviet Union. It was called the New Economic Policy, in which Lenin said, we're going to have something that looks like free market competition across society because there's just too much to control and manage, but the state is going to retain control of the commanding heights of the global economy, or of the economy. Steel production, technology, energy sectors, the core industries remain in state hands and in state control, and through those the state can really drive and direct economic policy, and then the state can engage with the rest of the world on terms that it controls. And so the China model really is export-led development, but with a much stronger state presence in that kind of production. So the export-led model of development really pushes back against the idea that of economic liberalism, there's no role for the state in terms of encouraging competition. Another variant of this would be what I'm going to just call Trumpian economic policy. It's not exclusive to Donald Trump, but I think that he really, in the United States, brought this to the forefront and challenged a lot of the core assumptions and the consensus that largely existed between the Democratic and Republican parties around economic liberalism. Like with economic or export-led development, there's the idea that government is going to protect select industries. That under President Trump, there was a real focus on protecting U.S. steel industries from global competition, and that was done through tariffs and anti-dumping rules, and even talk about subsidies. That you have debt-financed economic stimulus, so you're going to use government borrowing to really supercharge the economy and run at sort of maximum capacity. President Trump moved the United States away from multi-party trade deals and focused more on bilateral trade deals, where potentially the size of the U.S. economy would give it a greater leverage in that bilateral negotiation rather than a global World Trade Organization style negotiation. And there was this idea also that I think was really unique to Donald Trump's sort of economic policy, but actually has currents of mercantilism, isn't it? That a state's economic dynamism is augmented, maybe even rests upon really 17th, 16th, 15th century kinds of relations in terms of tribute. Other states will pay you for the privilege of protection, pillage, that the United States ought to be taking the oil from Iraq, and then arms sales. The arms sales were a way that the United States could really bolster its economy by pushing weapons out to client states. Again, I think this economic model is akin to something we saw under mercantilism. Maybe it's akin to something we saw under ancient empires, but I think really reflects a breakdown in the assumptions about how to pursue economic prosperity that derived from economic liberalism and really became dominant in the 20th century, and now seem to be cracking a little bit, both with states like China that are pursuing a different model of development and are pushing a different model of development, but also in the United States, which had long been sort of the foundation of that assumption of economic liberalism, that's the way to prosperity, where that assumption about markets and about international trade seems to be breaking down and returning to something more akin to economic nationalism. So when I started teaching this course, I kind of really emphasized economic liberalism and economic nationalism as sort of a critique that was over there. And I think we're at a moment in time where these two perspectives on the global economy are really at loggerheads and are really struggling for this question about how the global economy should function, how states should navigate within that global economy.